Hello everyone. Today, we find ourselves living in an era that is more connected than any other point in history. We have technology at our fingertips, social media platforms that allow us to communicate with anyone, anywhere, and an overwhelming amount of information flowing constantly. Yet, despite this abundance of tools to communicate, misunderstandings seem to arise more often than ever before. This brings us to an important issue that plagues modern life: lack of clarity in communication. When we think about what it means to communicate, the most basic definition comes to mind: the exchange of ideas or information between people. However, in our day-to-day lives, communication goes far beyond just transmitting information. It's about connecting with others, sharing experiences, and understanding different perspectives. But when that exchange of ideas is clouded, when it lacks clarity, it leads to a breakdown not only in communication itself, but in relationships, societies, and even our sense of well-being. To truly understand this issue, let's step back and reflect through the lens of philosophy. The ancient Greek philosopher Socrates once said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." What Socrates meant was that a life lived without reflection, without questioning the deeper truths, is empty. This applies to communication as well. Without clarity, without examining what we say and how we say it, we risk misinterpreting the world around us, and worse, having the world misinterpret us. So, why do we face this problem of unclear communication so much today? In many ways, the very tools that make communication easier also create barriers to clarity. For example, think of social media. We are constantly sending and receiving short, rapid bursts of information. Tweets, posts, texts. Communication has become so condensed that we often sacrifice depth for speed. In doing so, we fail to fully express what we mean, or worse, others fail to grasp the full meaning behind our words. This brings us to the Stoic philosopher Epictetus. He believed that clarity in thought leads to clarity in life. He often taught that the words we use should be chosen carefully, with intention and mindfulness. In his time, communication wasn't nearly as fast-paced as it is today, but his wisdom still rings true. He urged us to speak and act with purpose, to reflect on the words we use, and to ensure they align with what we truly mean. Now let's think about today's human life issues. We live in a time where misunderstandings can have serious consequences. Whether it's in personal relationships, in the workplace, or even in global politics, lack of clarity can create friction and conflict. A message sent without full understanding can be misinterpreted, causing emotional hurt, anxiety, or even mistrust. On a larger scale, unclear communication between nations can lead to international disputes, heightening tensions in an already fragile world. We must also recognize that language is not just words. It's a reflection of culture, identity, and values. The philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein argued that the limits of my language mean the limits of my world. When our words are vague, when we do not take the time to articulate what we truly mean, we limit our capacity to connect with others. In a world that is more diverse than ever, where people from different cultural and linguistic backgrounds interact daily, it becomes even more crucial to be clear and mindful in our communication. When clarity is missing, so too is our understanding of one another, our ability to work together, and our chances of finding common ground. Let's take a common example from today's world: workplace communication. In many organizations, the pressure to perform quickly often leads to hasty emails, brief conversations, or vague instructions. Employees may find themselves confused about what is expected of them. In this rush to communicate quickly, crucial details are left out, leading to errors, inefficiencies, and sometimes even a toxic work environment. The result: a cycle of frustration, demotivation, and inefficiency. Now, imagine if we approached workplace communication with a more mindful, philosophical perspective. Imagine if, before sending a message or giving instructions, we paused for a moment, took a deep breath, and asked ourselves, is what I'm about to say clear? Is it aligned with my intentions? Will the person on the other end understand not just my words, but my meaning? This simple act of reflection could prevent so many unnecessary misunderstandings and lead to healthier, more effective communication in the workplace. Another example is within our personal relationships. How often have we seen friendships, marriages, or family bonds strained because of miscommunication? A misunderstood text, a vague comment, or a lack of proper explanation can create rifts in relationships that are hard to repair. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche once said, "I'm not upset that you lied to me. I'm upset that from now on I can't believe you." While Nietzsche was speaking about trust, this sentiment applies to communication as well. When clarity is missing, trust erodes, and when trust erodes, relationships suffer. So, how can we bring clarity into our communication? First and foremost, we must embrace self-awareness. As philosophers like Socrates and Epictetus urge, we must reflect on ourselves before we engage with others. This means being aware of our own emotions, biases, and intentions when we communicate. When we speak from a place of honesty and understanding, our words carry more weight and are less likely to be misinterpreted. Second, we must practice active listening. Communication is not just about expressing our own thoughts, it's about understanding the other person. Often, misunderstandings arise because we are too focused on what we want to say rather than truly listening to what the other person is trying to convey. By listening more attentively, we can respond more clearly and appropriately, reducing the chances of confusion. Finally, we need to slow down. In a world that demands quick responses and instant communication, it's easy to fall into the trap of speaking or writing without thinking. But clarity requires time. It requires us to pause, to choose our words carefully, and to ensure that what we say reflects our true meaning. In conclusion, while modern life presents many challenges to clear communication, the wisdom of the past can guide us in overcoming these barriers. By embracing self-awareness, practicing active listening, and taking the time to communicate with purpose, we can bring more clarity into our lives. As philosophers have taught us, clarity in thought leads to clarity in action, and ultimately, clarity in life. As we have just discussed, lack of clarity in communication is one of the key reasons misunderstandings occur in modern life. But it's not the only barrier we face when trying to connect with one another. Now, I want to delve deeper into another critical factor that often distorts communication: emotional barriers. We, as human beings, are not only rational creatures but emotional ones. Our emotions are an essential part of who we are. They guide our decisions, fuel our passions, and help us connect with others on a deeper level. However, when emotions like anger, fear, or frustration dominate our interactions, they can become barriers to effective communication. These emotional barriers prevent us from truly listening, responding with empathy, and communicating in a way that fosters understanding. In the philosophical tradition, emotions have long been debated. The Stoics, in particular, were highly critical of letting emotions control our lives. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor and Stoic philosopher, often reflected on how emotions, when unchecked, lead to poor decisions and misunderstandings. He famously wrote in his Meditations, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." This wisdom applies perfectly to the emotional barriers we face in communication today. Let's take a closer look at how emotions interfere with our ability to communicate clearly and constructively. One of the most common emotions that disrupt communication is anger. We've all experienced moments when we've lashed out in anger, whether it's a heated argument with a loved one, a conflict at work, or a disagreement with a friend. In those moments, our ability to think rationally and speak clearly becomes clouded. Instead of listening to the other person, we become focused on defending ourselves, proving a point, or expressing our frustration. The result: the conversation devolves into a battle of words rather than an exchange of ideas. Seneca, another Stoic philosopher, wrote extensively about anger in his work on anger. He warned that anger is a destructive emotion that can ruin relationships and cloud judgment. He urged people to practice patience and control their emotions, especially in times of conflict. As Seneca wisely put it, the greatest remedy for anger is delay. In other words, before we let anger dictate our words, we must pause, reflect, and ask ourselves whether what we are about to say will contribute to understanding or fuel the fire of conflict. This advice is particularly relevant in today's world, where emotional communication is rampant, especially online. Social media platforms have become breeding grounds for emotional outbursts, whether it's through angry comments, impulsive tweets, or heated debates. People are quick to react emotionally, often without fully considering the impact of their words. In this environment, communication becomes reactive rather than reflective, and meaningful dialogue is often lost. But it's not just anger that can create emotional barriers. Fear is another powerful emotion that prevents us from communicating effectively. Fear of rejection, fear of judgment, fear of vulnerability. These emotions can make us hold back our true thoughts and feelings. We may avoid difficult conversations altogether or tiptoe around important issues because we're afraid of the consequences. This lack of openness leads to superficial communication, where important matters remain unspoken and misunderstandings fester beneath the surface. Philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre, the existentialist thinker, often explored the idea of fear and freedom. He believed that humans are free to make choices, but are often paralyzed by the fear of responsibility and the unknown. In communication, this fear manifests as hesitation and avoidance. When we allow fear to govern our interactions, we miss opportunities for genuine connection and growth. Sartre's philosophy reminds us that to truly communicate, we must confront our fears and embrace the vulnerability that comes with honest expression. Let's consider how fear affects communication in today's world, especially in our personal relationships. Many people find it difficult to express their true feelings to their partners, friends, or family members. They may fear that being honest will lead to conflict or rejection, so they choose to remain silent or only share surface-level thoughts. Over time, this lack of emotional transparency can create distance between people, leading to feelings of isolation and disconnection. To overcome this emotional barrier, we must adopt a mindset of courage and vulnerability. The philosopher Brené Brown, who has extensively researched vulnerability, argues that being vulnerable is not a sign of weakness, but a source of strength. She says, vulnerability is not winning or losing. It's having the courage to show up and be seen when we have no control over the outcome. In communication, this means being brave enough to express our emotions honestly, even when it's uncomfortable. By doing so, we create space for deeper, more meaningful connections with others. Now let's address another emotional barrier that often goes unnoticed: resentment. This emotion is more subtle than anger or fear, but it can be just as destructive. Resentment often builds up over time when we feel wronged or unappreciated. It's the emotion that lingers after unresolved conflicts, leading us to hold grudges and view others through a lens of bitterness. When resentment takes hold, our ability to communicate with compassion and empathy diminishes. Instead of seeking resolution or understanding, we become focused on protecting our own sense of pride or self-righteousness. The ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle believed that emotions like resentment arise when we perceive an injustice. While it's natural to feel hurt when we've been wronged, Aristotle warned against letting such emotions dominate our lives. He emphasized the importance of practicing virtue, particularly the virtue of forgiveness. Forgiveness, he argued, is not about condoning harmful behavior, but about freeing ourselves from the emotional weight of resentment. When we forgive, we clear the emotional barriers that prevent us from communicating openly and honestly. In modern life, where relationships, whether personal, professional, or social, are often strained by competing interests and misunderstandings, the practice of forgiveness becomes essential. Holding on to resentment keeps us stuck in a cycle of negative communication, where every word is colored by past hurts. But when we choose to let go of that resentment, we open the door to more constructive and empathetic dialogue. So, how can we break down these emotional barriers in communication? First, we must practice emotional regulation. This is a concept deeply rooted in Stoic philosophy, where the goal is to gain control over our emotional responses. As Epictetus famously said, "It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters." By learning to manage our emotions, whether it's anger, fear, or resentment, we can prevent them from distorting our communication. Second, we need to cultivate empathy. Empathy is the ability to understand and share the feelings of another person. It's the antidote to emotional barriers because it shifts our focus from our own emotional state to that of the person we're communicating with. When we listen with empathy, we create a space for mutual understanding and connection, even in the face of difficult emotions. Finally, we must embrace emotional honesty. This means being willing to express our emotions openly and authentically, rather than bottling them up or letting them fester. By communicating how we truly feel, we give others the opportunity to understand us on a deeper level and respond with empathy and compassion. In conclusion, emotional barriers are a significant obstacle to clear and effective communication in modern life. But by learning to regulate our emotions, practicing empathy, and embracing emotional honesty, we can break down these barriers and foster deeper connections with those around us. Just as with clarity, the way we manage our emotions in communication can shape the quality of our relationships, our work, and our sense of fulfillment in life. We've now explored two major barriers to effective communication: lack of clarity and emotional interference. Both of these can seriously impact our ability to connect with others in meaningful ways. However, there is another, often less obvious, but equally harmful obstacle that we must confront: assumptions and biases. In modern life, where information comes at us rapidly and constantly, we're all guilty of making snap judgments. Our minds are wired to process the world quickly, to make sense of complex situations by filling in the gaps with what we already know or believe. But this tendency to assume, to jump to conclusions or rely on preconceived biases, can be deeply damaging to our ability to communicate effectively. The philosopher Immanuel Kant once said, "We see things not as they are, but as we are." This insight captures the essence of the problem. Our assumptions and biases act like filters, shaping how we interpret the world around us. And when these filters cloud our communication, they prevent us from truly understanding one another. Let's start by considering assumptions, those judgments we make without evidence, based on incomplete information. Think about how often in your daily life you encounter situations where you make assumptions about someone's intentions, their thoughts, or their motivations. Maybe it's a coworker who sent a curt email, and you assume they're upset with you. Or perhaps it's a family member who didn't respond to a text, and you assume they're ignoring you. In reality, we don't know the full story, but our assumptions fill in the gaps, often in a way that creates misunderstanding. Assumptions, by their nature, are shortcuts. They allow us to quickly assess a situation without gathering all the information. But the problem is that these shortcuts can be dangerously misleading. The ancient philosopher Plato touched on this in his famous allegory of the cave. In the story, prisoners are chained inside a dark cave, and they see only the shadows of objects, not the objects themselves. For them, the shadows are reality, even though they represent only a distorted version of the truth. Our assumptions are like those shadows. We believe them to be true, but they are often far from the full picture. In today's fast-paced world, where we are constantly bombarded by information, it's easy to see why assumptions have become so prevalent. We don't always have the time or energy to dig deeper, to ask questions, or to seek clarification. And yet, this reliance on assumptions can lead to serious communication breakdowns, both in our personal relationships and in society at large. Let's take a common scenario in the workplace. A manager gives feedback to an employee, and the employee assumes that the feedback is a criticism of their overall performance, rather than constructive advice on a specific task. This assumption leads to defensiveness, resentment, and a lack of trust, when, In reality, the manager's intention was to help the employee improve. If the employee had taken the time to clarify or ask questions, the misunderstanding could have been avoided. But assumptions, often fueled by insecurity or fear, prevent that from happening. Now, let's shift to the topic of biases. If assumptions are judgments we make without enough information, biases are the deep-seated beliefs or attitudes we hold about certain groups, individuals, or ideas. Biases are often unconscious, shaped by our upbringing, culture, and personal experiences. And while biases can sometimes help us navigate the world, they can also distort our communication in harmful ways. The philosopher David Hume argued that humans are not purely rational beings. Our reasoning is often influenced by our emotions and biases. He warned that we must be careful not to confuse our subjective feelings with objective truth. When it comes to communication, this warning is especially important. Our biases can lead us to interpret someone's words or actions in a way that aligns with our preconceptions rather than what they actually mean. For example, think about how stereotypes, a form of bias, impact communication. We may unconsciously assume that someone from a particular background or culture behaves or thinks in a certain way, and this assumption colors how we listen to them. Instead of engaging with the person as an individual, we filter their words through the lens of our bias. As a result, we miss the opportunity for genuine understanding and connection. Biases are not just limited to personal interactions. They also shape how we consume and communicate information on a societal level. In today's polarized world, political and ideological biases have created deep divides. People tend to surround themselves with information that confirms their existing beliefs, a phenomenon known as confirmation bias. This makes it difficult to engage in meaningful dialogue with those who hold different perspectives. Instead of seeking to understand opposing viewpoints, we dismiss them as wrong or misguided, reinforcing our own biases in the process. Philosophers like John Stuart Mill championed the idea of open-mindedness as a key to overcoming bias. Mill believed that in order to discover the truth, we must be willing to consider all sides of an argument, even those that challenge our deeply held beliefs. In communication, this means approaching conversations with a sense of humility, recognizing that our assumptions and biases are not infallible. By doing so, we create space for learning, growth, and understanding. So how do we combat the influence of assumptions and biases in our communication? The first step is awareness. We must recognize that we all have assumptions and biases, and that these mental shortcuts can distort how we interpret information. By acknowledging their existence, we become more mindful of their impact on our communication. This mindfulness allows us to pause before jumping to conclusions, to question our assumptions, and to approach conversations with a more open mind. The second step is curiosity. Instead of assuming we know what someone means or what their intentions are, we should ask questions. Socrates, the father of Western philosophy, was known for his method of questioning as a way to uncover deeper truths. By asking open-ended questions, questions that seek to understand rather than to judge, we can break free from the limitations of our assumptions and biases. For example, instead of assuming that a colleague's short email means they're upset, we can ask for clarification. Is there something on your mind? Or could you explain a bit more about what you meant? Finally, we must practice empathy. Empathy helps us step outside of our own perspectives and consider how others may see the world. It's a powerful tool for overcoming biases because it forces us to recognize the humanity in others, even when their experiences or viewpoints differ from our own. When we approach communication with empathy, we listen not just to respond, but to understand. We move beyond our assumptions and biases to truly connect with the other person. In conclusion, assumptions and biases are subtle yet powerful barriers to effective communication. They prevent us from seeing the full picture, from engaging with others in an open and honest way. But by becoming aware of these barriers, cultivating curiosity, and practicing empathy, we can overcome them. we can move toward a form of communication that is not just about exchanging words, but about building bridges of understanding and connection in a world that so desperately needs it. As we've explored throughout this journey, from clarity to emotional regulation, and now assumptions and biases, each of these elements is essential to fostering better communication in modern life. And just as philosophers throughout history have urged us to seek truth, wisdom, and understanding, we too must strive to communicate in ways that reflect these higher ideals. Thank you.